was never supposed to be heard. It sat sealed in an evidence bag for 9 years, labeled only with a case number and a date. No description, no transcript, no note explaining why it existed. Just a small digital voice recorder recovered from a locked apartment where a man had vanished without a trace. When the storage room was finally audited years later, the file was rediscovered by accident. A clerk logged it, powered the device, and pressed play. At first, there was only silence. Then a man's voice, shaky and whispering, said he didn't think he had much time left. The man was Daniel Mercer, 34 years old, a freelance audio engineer who lived alone in a third-floor apartment in the city of Ashford. He was known for meticulous habits and a quiet routine. He worked from home, rarely socialized, and paid his rent early every month. His neighbors described him as polite but forgettable. On March 18th, he stopped answering messages. By March 21st, his sister reported him missing. Police entered his apartment with the landlord present. The chain was latched from the inside. The deadbolt was locked. All windows were sealed. Nothing appeared disturbed. His wallet and keys were on the kitchen counter. His laptop sat open on the desk. His bed looked slept in. Daniel Mercer was nowhere inside. There was no sign he had left, and no way anyone could have entered. The case was briefly investigated, then slowly drifted into the category investigators hate most: unexplained disappearance. No evidence of violence, no financial activity, no travel records, no body. The recorder was found days later during a second sweep of the apartment. It had slipped behind a stack of acoustic foam panels near Daniel's desk. At the time, detectives listened to only the first minute, assumed it was a personal work note, and filed it away. They never realized the recording captured the final hours before Daniel Mercer vanished from a locked room. Years later, when the file was played in full, the timeline began at 9:12 p.m. Daniel's voice sounded tired but controlled. He said he was making the recording because something strange had been happening in the apartment for the past week. Small things at first. Sounds he couldn't trace. Objects slightly out of place. He assumed it was stress or lack of sleep. But that night something had changed. He said he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment door. Not unusual on its own. The building had thin walls, but these steps stopped directly outside his door and stayed there. He described standing in the kitchen, holding his breath, waiting to hear a knock. None came. Instead, he heard what sounded like a soft, dragging sound, like someone slowly running their fingers along the wood of the door. Daniel said he checked the peephole. No one was there. He opened the door quickly, expecting to catch someone walking away. The hallway was empty. He locked the door again and laughed nervously into the recorder, saying he was probably just overtired. But as he spoke, the recording picked up a faint sound behind him inside the apartment. A soft click. Daniel stopped talking mid-sentence. He turned and his voice dropped to a whisper as he said the bathroom light had just turned on. He was certain he hadn't touched the switch. He called out, asking if anyone was there, then immediately said that was impossible because he lived alone and the door had been locked. His breathing grew louder as he walked across the apartment. The recorder captured the sound of his footsteps, the slight echo of the small hallway, and then the creak of the bathroom door opening. He said the room was empty. The light was on. Nothing else. He turned it off and walked back to the living room, trying to sound calm. He told himself electrical faults happen, old wiring, loose switches, nothing more. Then he stopped again. This time he whispered that the bedroom door was closed. He said he always kept it open while working. The recording captured a long stretch of silence while he walked toward it. The floorboards creaked softly. His breathing sounded shallow now, tight in his chest. He pushed the bedroom door open. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance. The bed, the wardrobe, the desk lamp. Then Daniel said something that investigators would replay over and over. He said the wardrobe door was slightly open and he was absolutely sure he had closed it earlier. He laughed again, but there was no humor in it now. He told himself he was being ridiculous. Still, he crossed the room and pulled the wardrobe door open fully. Nothing inside but clothes. He exhaled, long and shaky, and muttered that he needed sleep. Then very quietly, he said he was going to check the front door one more time. The recording followed him back into the hallway. The lock clicked as he tested it. Still locked. Chain still latched. He said out loud that no one could have come in. And that was when the sound happened. At first, it was so faint, investigators nearly missed it. A soft, dull thump somewhere deeper in the apartment. Daniel heard it immediately. He froze mid-sentence. Another thump followed, this time clearer. He whispered that the sound had come from above him, like something shifting in the ceiling. Ashford apartments were old, with a narrow crawl space between floors for pipes and wiring. Daniel mentioned this, trying to explain it logically. He said maybe a rat or a loose pipe. Then came a slow scraping sound. Not quick, like an animal. Slow, deliberate, moving across the ceiling from the bedroom toward the living room. Daniel's breathing turned ragged. He spoke very softly now, as if afraid of being heard. He said he was going to step outside and call building maintenance, but when he reached the door, the recording captured the metallic rattle of the handle refusing to turn. He tried again, still locked. He said that didn't make sense. The deadbolt should open easily from inside. He slid the chain loose, tried again. The handle wouldn't move. His voice tightened as he said the door felt jammed. He pulled harder. Nothing. Then he whispered something investigators later confirmed, chilled everyone who heard it. He said he could hear movement directly above the front door now, as if whatever was in the ceiling had followed him there. There was a faint cracking sound overhead, like pressure on old plaster. Daniel stepped back. The recorder picked up dust falling lightly onto the floor. He said he was going to grab something to stand on and check the ceiling hatch in the hallway. Every apartment had one, a small square panel giving access to the crawl space. His footsteps hurried now. A chair scraped across the floor. Wood creaked as he climbed. For several seconds, there was only the sound of his breathing very close to the recorder. Then he whispered that the hatch was slightly open. Just a fraction. He said he never opened it. Not once in the 2 years he'd lived there. His voice trembled as he described reaching up slowly and pushing the panel. It lifted with a soft, dry scrape. For a moment there was silence. Then Daniel inhaled sharply. He didn't scream. He didn't shout. He just whispered one sentence so quietly it almost disappeared into static. He said there was someone looking back at him. The next sounds were chaotic. The chair tipped. The recorder clattered to the floor. Heavy footsteps stumbled backward. Daniel's breathing became frantic, panicked, struggling for air as he tried to speak. He kept repeating that there was a man in the crawl space, that the man hadn't said anything, that he had just been lying there in the dark, watching through the gap, listening. Daniel shouted that he was calling the police, but then he stopped suddenly. The recording captured another sound, a soft thud from the hallway ceiling, followed by the unmistakable creak of weight dropping down onto the other side. Inside the apartment, Daniel whispered that he had heard something land behind him. For several seconds, there was only the sound of his breathing and a faint, slow footstep somewhere out of range of the recorder. One step, then another. Closer. Daniel's voice broke as he asked who was there. No answer came. The footsteps stopped. The recording held a long stretch of silence, and then very close to the microphone, Daniel whispered that the bedroom door had just clicked shut. The final minute of the tape was almost entirely breathing. Daniel sounded like he was backing away slowly, step by step. He whispered that he couldn't see anyone, that the apartment looked empty, that the bathroom light had turned on again by itself. Another step sounded behind him, much closer this time. Daniel gasped. The recorder shifted slightly, fabric brushing against it as if he had grabbed it or kicked it by accident. He whispered that whoever it was standing right behind him. There was one last sound. A sudden sharp impact. The recording cut to silence. Daniel Mercer was never seen again. His apartment was still locked from the inside when police entered 3 days later, and there was no crawl space hatch left open. It was sealed shut. When police first entered Daniel Mercer's apartment, they believed they were walking into a routine missing persons investigation. There was no forced entry, no broken furniture, no sign of violence. The place was clean, orderly, and strangely untouched. His laptop sat open on the desk. A mug with dried coffee rested beside it. His phone lay charging on the bedside table. His wallet and keys were still in the apartment. Nothing suggested he had planned to leave. Nothing suggested he could have left at all. The chain on the front door was still latched from the inside when officers arrived with the landlord. They had to force the door open. The windows were sealed shut. The fire escape outside the living room window showed no sign of use. Dust along the sill remained undisturbed. It was the kind of scene detectives privately call impossible. A grown man doesn't simply disappear from a locked apartment without leaving something behind. At first, they searched for the obvious answers: medical emergency, sudden mental break, hidden second exit. None of them fit. There was no access panel large enough for a person besides the crawlspace hatch in the hallway ceiling, and that panel was firmly closed when officers inspected it. No footprints marked the chair beneath it. No scratches showed it had been opened recently. If someone had entered through the ceiling, there was no proof. And if Daniel had climbed into the crawlspace himself, there was nowhere for him to go. The narrow overhead space ran the length of the building but connected only to sealed utility channels and neighboring apartments, each blocked by wooden partitions and insulation. Search teams opened the hatch anyway. Inside, they found only darkness, dust, and the smell of old timber. No person, no bedding, no hidden belongings. Nothing at all. The investigation stalled within days. Without the recording, the case might have stayed that way forever. When detectives finally listened to the full audio years later, it changed the entire timeline of Daniel Mercer's last night. It proved that someone else had been inside the apartment. Someone who had likely been living above him, hidden in the crawl space, watching and waiting. But back in 2017, no one knew that yet. All they had were small details that didn't quite add up. The first detail came from the downstairs neighbor, a woman named Lila Chen. She told officers she occasionally heard faint sounds above her ceiling late at night. Not footsteps exactly, but soft, shifting noises, like something being dragged slowly across wood. She assumed it was pipes expanding or someone in the apartment above moving furniture. But Daniel lived above her, which meant the sounds came from somewhere higher. Another neighbor, an elderly man named Thomas Greer, who lived across the hall, mentioned something stranger. He said that twice in the previous month, he'd noticed the hallway ceiling panel near Daniel's door slightly misaligned, as if it hadn't been pushed fully back into place. He thought maintenance workers must have been checking wiring or plumbing. Building management insisted no maintenance had been scheduled. When detectives questioned them further, they learned the building security cameras covering the third-floor hallway had been offline for nearly 6 weeks, due to what management described as a wiring fault. Repairs had been scheduled but delayed. No footage existed showing who had entered or left Daniel's hallway during that time. Detectives began reviewing Daniel's personal life more closely. His bank accounts showed normal activity until the day he vanished. No large withdrawals, no suspicious transfers. His email contained mostly freelance audio work, client revisions, and routine invoices. But buried among the messages was a short email sent to building management 11 days before he disappeared. In it, Daniel mentioned hearing noises in the ceiling at night. He asked if anyone had access to the crawl space and whether maintenance had been scheduled. Management responded with a brief reply saying no work had been planned, and suggesting the sounds were likely old pipes or small animals. Daniel never followed up. When investigators searched his computer, they found something else. A folder containing several short audio files recorded over the previous week. Each one lasted only a few seconds. Each one captured faint nighttime sounds inside his apartment. Soft taps, a distant creak overhead, what sounded like slow movement above the ceiling. In one file recorded at 2:08 a.m., there was a barely audible noise that analysts later enhanced. It sounded like breathing. Not Daniel's breathing near the microphone, but a second, faint breath somewhere higher, muffled by wood and plaster. At the time, the files were dismissed as ambient noise. Only later did they seem ominous. Detectives returned to the building and decided to examine the crawl space more thoroughly. This time, they didn't just glance inside with a flashlight. They brought ladders, protective gear, and portable lights. When they opened the hatch again and climbed up, the first thing they noticed was how easy it was to move once inside. The crawl space was narrow but continuous, running above the hallway and branching slightly over each apartment. Wooden beams divided sections, but some of the partitions were thin enough to squeeze past or had small gaps near the edges. It wasn't comfortable, but it was possible for someone determined enough to move quietly from one section to another. About 6 meters from Daniel's hatch, one officer spotted something caught between the beams. A crumpled plastic bottle. It was empty, dusty, and clearly out of place. Nearby, they found a second item. A chocolate wrapper, then another, and another. The deeper they searched, the clearer it became that someone had spent time up there. Hidden between insulation rolls and beams, they found a small cluster of objects: food packaging, 2 empty water bottles, and a thin blanket flattened against the wood. There was even a narrow groove in the dust, where a body might have lain repeatedly, facing downward toward the ceiling below, toward Daniel's apartment. The realization settled in slowly and heavily. Someone had been living in the crawl space, not for a night, for days, possibly weeks. And from the position of the makeshift bedding, they had been directly above Daniel Mercer's hallway, watching, listening, waiting. Investigators immediately widened their search across the entire crawlspace network. In another section closer to the stairwell, they found more signs. Footprints in the dust, a small backpack, and inside it, several disturbing items. A flashlight with nearly dead batteries, a cheap prepaid phone with no SIM card inserted, a folding utility knife, and a notebook. The notebook contained no name, no address, nothing identifying the owner. Most pages were blank, but scattered throughout were short, jagged notes written in cramped handwriting. Times, dates, single words. Lights off 11:43. Phone call Sunday. Leaves for work 7:02. Returns 5:31. And over again, one name written in darker, heavier strokes. Daniel. The notebook also included a rough sketch of the apartment layout, including the location of the hallway hatch and the bedroom. Whoever had written it hadn't just been hiding. They had been studying him. By the time the crawlspace search ended, detectives knew they were dealing with something far more sinister than a random disappearance. Someone had secretly occupied the space above Daniel's home, tracked his routine, and at some point entered the apartment itself. But the biggest question remained. Where had that person gone? There was no sign anyone had climbed down into another apartment. No reports of intruders elsewhere in the building. The stairwell door leading to the roof had been locked from the inside and showed no sign of tampering. It was as if the person in the crawl space had vanished just as completely as Daniel Mercer. The case drew brief media attention once the crawl space discovery became public. Headlines described a hidden squatter or stalker living above tenants. Residents demanded inspections. Management sealed several access panels and installed new cameras. But without a suspect, the story slowly faded. Months passed. Then a forensic analyst reviewing the evidence made a small but crucial observation. The prepaid phone found in the backpack had no SIM card, but its internal memory still contained a handful of saved audio files. Most were blank or corrupted, but one contained a short recording lasting only 14 seconds. It had been captured 2 nights before Daniel vanished. At first it sounded like nothing more than muffled rustling. Then, faintly, Daniel's voice could be heard below, talking on the phone, unaware he was being recorded from above his own ceiling. Near the end of the clip, another sound emerged. A whisper very close to the microphone. So quiet it almost blended with static. After enhancement, the words became just clear enough to understand. The whisper said, "Soon." That was the first real indication that whoever had been living above Daniel hadn't just been watching him. They had been planning something. Investigators tried to trace the phone's purchase history, but it had been bought with cash at a convenience store miles away. No cameras inside the store still retained footage from that date. The notebook handwriting yielded no match in criminal databases. The knife carried no usable fingerprints. Every lead dissolved. Daniel Mercer's case slipped into the cold file archive, marked unresolved, until 9 years later, when the rediscovered recorder revealed what had actually happened during his final hour. Because the tape didn't just capture fear. It captured the moment the watcher finally came down from the ceiling. And when detectives synchronized the recording timeline with the apartment layout and the crawl space evidence, they realized something deeply unsettling. Daniel had opened the hatch himself, which meant the person above him hadn't broken in that night. They were already inside, waiting for him to look up. And when he did, the only barrier between them was a thin wooden panel and a few seconds of silence. After that, there was nothing at all. For 9 years, Daniel Mercer's disappearance remained a sealed mystery. The rediscovered recording changed that overnight. Investigators reopened the file and rebuilt the timeline from the beginning, this time treating the audio as the central piece of evidence instead of an afterthought. Every second of the tape was mapped against the apartment layout, the crawl space structure, and the objects found above the ceiling. What emerged wasn't random, it was methodical. The sounds Daniel described matched the physical evidence almost perfectly. Movement above the bedroom, shifting toward the hallway, dust falling near the front door. The hatch already loosened before he touched it. Whoever had been hiding in the crawl space hadn't arrived that night. They had already been living there. Waiting for the moment Daniel noticed, the next step was to identify who could have accessed the crawl space without attracting attention. Detectives revisited old tenant records, maintenance logs, and contractor lists from the months before Daniel vanished. The building had changed management twice in 3 years, and record keeping was inconsistent. Still, one name surfaced repeatedly in older service reports. A maintenance technician named Victor Hale. Victor had worked for the previous property company for nearly 2 years before Daniel's disappearance. His duties included electrical inspections, ceiling access checks, and repairs to wiring lines running through the crawl space. He would have known exactly how the ceiling panels opened, which partitions were loose, and how to move through the overhead space without being seen. At first, the name didn't seem remarkable, until detectives discovered Victor Hale had abruptly left the job just 3 weeks before Daniel vanished. No notice, no forwarding address. His employment file contained only a photocopy of an ID, an expired phone number, and a payroll account that had been closed shortly after his departure. When officers tracked the ID, they found it belonged to a real person, but the photo didn't match Victor. The identity had been stolen years earlier. Victor Hale, it turned out, had never officially existed. That revelation pushed the investigation in a darker direction. Whoever had been living in the crawl space wasn't just hiding. They had deliberately placed themselves inside the building under false pretenses, learning its layout from the inside. And then they had stayed. Detectives searched other missing persons reports from nearby towns and eventually found something unsettling. 2 years before Daniel's disappearance, another tenant in a different building owned by the same company had reported hearing sounds in the ceiling at night. Maintenance inspected and found nothing. The tenant moved out a month later, uneasy but unharmed. The technician assigned to that inspection had also signed his name as Victor Hale. There was no proof of a crime in that earlier case, just a lingering suspicion that someone had been testing how long they could remain hidden above occupied apartments without detection. If that was true, Daniel Mercer may not have been chosen randomly. He may have simply been the first tenant who noticed. The biggest challenge remained explaining how both Daniel and the intruder vanished from a locked apartment. The recording held the answer, but it took repeated forensic analysis to hear it clearly. In the final minute of the tape, beneath Daniel's breathing and the faint shuffle behind him, there was another sound investigators initially dismissed as background noise, a low, metallic click. When audio engineers isolated and amplified it, the sound became distinct. It was the sliding mechanism of the apartment's chain lock, but not from the front door, from behind it. The realization was subtle but devastating. The chain hadn't been latched when police arrived. It had been relatched afterward. That meant someone inside the apartment after Daniel's final recorded moment had secured the door from within before leaving another way. The only other possible exit was the crawl space. Investigators reconstructed what likely happened in Daniel's final minutes. After Daniel opened the hatch and saw the man above him, panic set in. He stepped back, dropped the recorder, and moved away from the hallway. The intruder, already poised at the opening, lowered himself silently into the apartment behind him. The two men were now inside together. Daniel backed into the living space, trying to understand what was happening. The intruder stayed close, possibly armed, possibly speaking quietly enough that the recorder didn't pick it up. At some point, Daniel was subdued. There were no signs of struggle in the apartment, which suggested the intruder either threatened him into compliance or incapacitated him quickly and quietly. Then came the part that had baffled investigators for years: the removal. If the intruder intended to escape unseen, the safest route wasn't the front door or windows. It was the same path they had used to enter the apartment repeatedly without detection. Up, back through the ceiling, carrying Daniel with them. The crawlspace beams were narrow but structurally strong. Forensic reconstruction showed it would have been physically possible, though difficult, for one determined adult to drag or lift another unconscious person into the hatch and pull the panel closed afterward. Once inside the crawlspace, the intruder could move toward the stairwell section, where a maintenance access ladder connected to a locked utility door. That door, investigators later discovered, could be opened from the inside without a key, but automatically locked behind anyone exiting. From there, the person could leave the building normally. The final act would have been returning briefly to Daniel's apartment entrance from inside the hallway, carefully relatching the chain through the narrow gap before pulling the door shut completely. A simple trick, one that would make the apartment appear sealed from the inside. It explained the impossible scene, but it didn't explain what happened to Daniel afterward. That answer came from a discovery made months into the reopened investigation. A rural property 30 kilometers outside Ashford had been scheduled for demolition after standing abandoned for years. Before the demolition, a routine inspection team entered the house and reported a foul smell in the basement. Police were called. Inside the basement, hidden behind a makeshift wooden partition, officers found evidence someone had been living there intermittently. Old blankets, food cans, tools, and a collection of small personal items taken from unknown sources. Among them was something unmistakable: Daniel Mercer's wallet. Further search of the property uncovered human remains buried in a shallow section of dirt beneath the concrete floor. Forensic testing confirmed the identity within days. Daniel Mercer had been dead less than a week after he vanished. The cause of death was blunt force trauma. The property records revealed the abandoned house had once belonged to a man arrested years earlier for burglary and unlawful entry. That man had died in prison, but the house had passed unofficially to a distant relative who never occupied it. The relative's name was Aaron Hale. Investigators couldn't confirm whether Aaron Hale and the false maintenance worker Victor Hale were biologically related, but the shared surname and the property connection suggested a link. By the time police traced Aaron's last known address, he had already disappeared. Neighbors at that address described a quiet man who kept to himself and worked temporary repair jobs. He moved out suddenly, not long after Daniel's disappearance, leaving almost nothing behind. No forwarding details, no digital trail, no confirmed sightings since. To this day, Aaron Hale has never been located. The case closed with the official conclusion that Daniel Mercer had been stalked by a man who infiltrated his apartment building under a false identity, lived secretly in the crawl space, and eventually confronted him when discovery became inevitable. But one detail continues to unsettle the investigators who worked the case. When the abandoned basement property was cleared, officers cataloged everything found there. Most items were random or stolen, but one box contained something more disturbing. Dozens of small notebooks, each one filled with observations written in the same cramped handwriting as the crawlspace notebook. Different names, different addresses, different routines. The earliest notebook dated back nearly 15 years. Daniel Mercer's name appeared only in the most recent one, which meant he was not the first person watched from inside their own walls, and possibly not the last. The final entry in the newest notebook had been written only days before the property was abandoned. It contained a single address investigators never managed to connect to any known victim. No explanation. No name beside it, just an address. And underneath it, one word: soon. The recorder that captured Daniel's final hour now sits archived again, this time properly labeled and fully transcribed. It remains one of the clearest documented cases of a long-term hidden intruder living inside a residential building without detection. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous place isn't outside your home. It's the empty space above your ceiling. And sometimes the sounds you dismiss in the night aren't pipes. They're footsteps waiting for you to look up.